mean, we're called to be innovative. It's not just about rules and regulations, but it's about how we do work with our campus administrators. I know you all hire one person that's president, right? That's it. But moreover, are you asking the presidents the right questions? Are you asking, I got board members here. I'm probably way too transparent. They probably want me to shut up most of the time. But the idea, are we really looking at what we need to look at? Are we looking at our data? Are we thinking about where we're going to be 5 years from now, you know, based on what our data are telling us now? The idea that it's more than just the business model from the practicality of making sure that you're financially safe and good. It's a business model from the practicality. Are we producing the product that we need to produce, and are we getting the right people to be a part of us to produce that? I'm not talking about selectivity now, because my argument is very clear that we need to be weeding people in instead of weeding people out. We've used this model. We'll give you a test or two, and that with that hope, you can be identified as a student we can help. Our job is to say, from the beginning, any student that we get, how do we help? And the board should be asking that question. Are we doing the things we need to do to provide that student that's under our roof with the outcomes that they need? Yes, you need to talk about money. I want you to do that, you know. But I hope that we really heard that many of our colleges and universities may not be here down the road if we don't figure out a new way of thinking. That's the truth. That's not me just saying it. I've been in higher education 37 years, I think, I had to think. And I've gone through a lot of different transitions, but the thing that I'm saying, this is a different transition unlike I've ever seen. And as he said, yes, COVID brought it to us faster, but it was coming. The idea that then, what are you charged to do in thinking futuristically? What are you charged to do to think about how many of our students are we serving at an equitable level? Are we grabbing the students we need to grab to help us to think about where our state needs to be in that regard? It is about student learning, no doubt, and to me, the board has a primary responsibility to do that. My job at CPE is to coordinate that. My job at CPE is to coordinate the universities to think that way, to strategically place themselves in that direction. Accountability, true enough, but moreover, thinking about how we use the brain that's in this collective body to look at how we take our individual institutions to a place that we know will be able to thrive down the road. That's my quick little speech. Any questions you want to ask me about anything before I turn it over to the people that are smarter than me once again? Any questions of me? None? Maybe the first time ever. I kind of like that, you know. I appreciate you all. I appreciate you being here. I just want to say that the council is here to serve you folk, to be able to do the things you need to do, and I'm happy myself to do it. These folks up here are happy to do it, and I'm going to introduce you to these two young men. You have Bill Payne, who is the Vice President of Finance and Budget. If you want to hear about performance funding, please just put on your microphone. Put on your recorder. Bill will talk to you a lot about that. Travis Powell. Travis is our General Counsel and Vice President over so many other things other than that. I almost hate to introduce him as our General Counsel. It doesn't make sense anymore, even though he does that too. Obviously working with KSU directly indeed. I appreciate you all. Have a good session, and I'll leave it up to you, sir.
Thanks, Aaron. Again, I'm Travis Powell, Vice President and General Counsel at CPE. So you all have to be here today. This is part of your new member orientation, but let this we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities, talk about governance of higher education in Kentucky, but let this sort of frame the work that you all do. We'll talk a little bit about where you all fit into the structure, what CPE does, what it doesn't do, what our campus boards do and what they don't do. And I'll talk a little bit of higher education reform in 1997 and sort of how that fits into the puzzle. if you have any questions as I go through this, I'm happy to answer them as we go through. You can wait to the end too. We might have a little bit of time, but just feel free to raise your hand. If you got any questions, I'm happy to answer it as we go through this. So don't feel like you can't interrupt me if you want some further explanation or you have some questions. I'm happy to answer them as we go along. So Post-Secondary Education Reform Act of 1997, House Bill 1. There's a House Bill 1 in every session, but this one is the one that we refer to as House Bill 1 in higher education from 97. It did to establish these goals, and I'll talk about this in a second, but the two major things that it did, at least in my opinion, was reconstitute the Council on Higher Education to the Council on Post-Secondary Education, broaden its scope a little bit, and broaden its sort of prominence in the higher ed landscape and make it more of a coordinating board as opposed to more of just sort of an administrative organization. But it also combined the community college and technical college systems into one system and created a new board for that. Those were the two major reforms. The bill is very long. If you Google that, you can look it up and see what was done in 97. But it established 6 major goals that were to be completed by 2020. And here we are in 2022. Those haven't been updated. It'll be interesting to see if the General Assembly decides to take it on to update those at some point. I won't read those off to you. Obviously, you can see those. Some of those we've attained, some we have not. But that was the major goals that set forth. But a lot can change in 20 plus years. As we work through this, the landscape of higher education has changed very, very much. If you can think back to 97 and maybe you were getting your first email account and kind of figuring out what the internet was. And so we've definitely come a long way. But we'll interesting to see if the General Assembly takes this up to sort of reconstitute higher education in the future. But this is where we started. So governance in higher education in Kentucky, we are what's called a coordinating board. And I think that's a good way to describe what we do. A lot of our activities are coordinating. We work with the campuses to coordinate joint efforts on a variety of actions that I'll talk about here in a little bit. Every state does this a little bit differently. Some states, I think California doesn't even have a coordinating board. Most states have some version of us. Some have most have less authority than we do, but every state's a little bit different. So in Kentucky, we have CPEs, the 15-member coordinating board. Just like your campuses, all our board members are appointed by the governor. It's in a very similar process. They're all staggered terms, so we have some. Usually, we have different gubernatorial appointees on our board. We have some appointees from Governor Bevin. We've got some appointees for Governor Beshear. Those change over time. If people resign, that changes the mix a little bit. But we have sort of. And just like your boards, not connected to the political process, all our staff members, if you know state government, we're all non-merit employees. On paper, we look like a political appointees, but actually we're really not. The council hires Dr. Thompson, and then we all work for him, basically. And so when administrations change at the gubernatorial level, our staff, we tend to not change. So we have some continuity, which I think is a really valuable thing in our organization. All the institutions have their own autonomous boards, boards of regents at our comprehensive universities and boards of trustees at our research universities. KCTCS is a system, you guys probably know that. Over the 16 community and technical college, they have individual advisory boards with some authority to provide guidance and help choose presidents, but ultimately the governing authority is at the system level. And of course, there's lots of private colleges, both for-profit and non-profit, that we license, and I'll talk about that here in a second. What are our major responsibilities? Most of these are captured in KRS Chapter 164.020. One of the things that I'll key on here is that our president, Dr. Thompson, serves as the state's chief higher education advisor to the governor and the General Assembly. So even though we're in the executive branch, statutorily, the CPE president is there for guidance, for direction, for both the General Assembly and the governor, and that is carried out daily. Dr. Thompson and CPE staff, we're constantly working with legislators, with the governor's office, about higher education in the state. So it's definitely important. That was a change in reform back in '97. We set educational attainment goals for the state as part of our strategic agenda. You've heard us talk about 60 by 30. We set goals for each one of our campuses on student success metrics, retention, graduation, degrees conferred. We set statewide goals for those. That's tied into the strategic agenda and a diversity policy that we have aligned with those state goals. I'll talk about the diversity policy here in a minute. We create a biennial budget request and performance funding model for adequate funding for our institutions. Bill's going to talk a lot about performance funding, and that's very important to the work that you all do on your campuses, but I'll speak for a minute on our biennial budget request because the council submits one combined budget request to the General Assembly for higher education as a whole. So we work with the campuses every 2 years, and sometimes every year, Bill, these days, with some changes during COVID when we had annual budgets. But usually on a 2-year process, we work with our campuses to submit one combined request to the governor's office, to the Office of State Budget Director, to get submitted as part of the governor's budget that goes through the process of adoption at the university. So we set the priorities for all funding for higher education in Kentucky and one request. So each institution does not submit its own request. We all do a combined request for higher education. We review and approve tuition rates, admission criteria, and academic programs. So we do approve tuition on your campuses. You all we'll set, the process works, and Bill manages that in his office. But we set a process where we work with the campuses. We set a tuition ceiling. We tend to focus on, while we do approve all tuition rates for everything, whether it be graduate programs, 2-year, 4-year degrees, we set all, but we tend to focus on undergraduate tuition as our primary focus, and we usually set a ceiling, sometimes a 2-year ceiling or a 1-year ceiling, so it would be a % increase over a certain amount of time that our institutions have to come within, and then your boards, campus boards, will approve a tuition rate within that ceiling, and then that will ultimately get adopted by the council, assuming it's within the parameters that we've set. We set the minimum admission criteria, so these are minimums. Our campuses have the ability to set higher standards if they want, but these are the minimums that we set per regulation at CPE. We also approve all the academic programs on your campuses too. There's a process for that, and again, those will go before you all and then ultimately on to CPE. So if you want to start a new program, we have a process of evaluating those programs. The boards will seek to have those approved, and those go to the council, and then those will get approved by CPE. We also have a process where we postpone the approval of new academic programs unless institutions meet their equal educational opportunity goals. We have a extended policy for that. I could talk for a whole session about how that works, but we set goals and targets for equity, both on low income and underrepresented minority students for student success. Have institutions evaluate the strategies that they're implementing in order to recruit, enroll, and graduate more underserved students. And if they don't meet the requirements, then they're unable to offer new academic programs for that year unless they get a waiver. So, and that's an annual process. We collect, analyze, and reports for comprehensive performance data. We have a tremendous amount of data. If you go on our website, CPE data dashboard, there's like 20, I looked at it this morning, there's like 21 different report mechanisms, interactive data that you can look at. You can look at enrollment. You can look at preliminary enrollment before, to kind of see where we're at before we actually get the final enrollment numbers done. You can see student success metrics, metrics for underrepresented students, low-income students, employment outcomes. We work with Kentucky Stats, our P20 data collaborative, that we can track a student all the way from, in most instances, all the way from kindergarten to the workforce. And you can get that information as well. It's just a wealth of information to compare institutions and see what programs are being offered. And it's quite impressive, the amount of work that's done by our data shop. And I encourage you to get on there and just kind of play around a little bit. It's quite immersive and a lot of good information there. Ensure coordination and connectivity of technology. We receive some money from the General Assembly that we provide to the campuses for our statewide network. And you think about, well, network, well, that's students getting on Wi-Fi at school and doing their work. Well, that's part of it. But there's so much data for research that's being transmitted, huge amounts of data. So it's important that we have a strong data and technology system so we can transport that data on our IT systems. So we get some money for that work. Orientation, that's what we're doing here today, so I don't have to belabor that. We work with campuses on transferability of credits among public 2-year and 4-year institutions. So we have a general education transfer agreement with our campuses. At all our campuses, general education requirements. If you take general ed courses at a KCTCS campus and transfer to a 4-year campus or between 4-year campuses or even from 4-year back to 2-year, those gen ed transfer credits do have to transfer and be not only transfer to be put on the transcript for the student, but also count towards those general education requirements. This was a very big issue. So, and you may have heard of this, but institutions would accept the credits, but they wouldn't count towards the degree requirements. So we made sure that that happens for general education. And I think, in the future we may start working on more of the programmatic transfer too, because, we know that students take courses. We just want to get, as a state, we want to get those students through and graduated, and where at the institution that best meets their needs at the time. So therefore, transfer of credit is important because we don't want to increase that time to degree if students transfer. Yeah. It could. Those were more for our technical type programs. This is general education. But yeah, absolutely. We want to make sure. Yeah, sure. He had a question about certification requirements, like what Dr. Levine was talking about with regard to technology and converting those competencies into credits and actually transferring those at the institutions. Yeah, no, they absolutely should. That's not really what that's talking about because that's from campus to campus, but we are focusing on that as well and making sure that, that those, when they do offer those credits, that they do count for degrees. You get those certifications. We want our, we hear about stackable credentials a lot. And I think that's really important. But we want to make sure that those get captured for credits to degree, because we don't want students to just stop. I mean, maybe that works for them. They get this certification, they go in on their job, but then maybe they want to move up in the organization. Maybe they want to go into management, and that new job may require a higher level of degree. Well, we need those credits to be able to transfer as part of that program, so we have to go back and retake something and get them through quicker. So. We license all the non-public post-secondary institutions to operate in the state. Anybody here from a private college? I didn't think so. I didn't hear anybody mention that earlier. But we do license all the private colleges to operate in the state. So your Transylvania universities, your Center colleges, Georgetown, Kentucky Wesleyan, we all license them to operate in the state. It's kind of a separate process, but similar. We have very high standards for our institutions to operate. Any institution that offers a bachelor's degree and above, we license them at the council, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit. Below the bachelor's degree is licensed by the Commission on Proprietary Education, and that also includes non-degree type stuff as well. So they license modeling schools, truck driving schools, all that, all the way up to associate's degrees as well. But once you offer your first bachelor's degree, then we take everything else at CPE. So that's a pretty large part of what we do, but some of it doesn't get seen a lot. It's kind of in the background, but very important. We administer the Kentucky's virtual library. These provide both in our post-secondary institutions, but at our public and K-12 libraries as well. These are digital resources that you can go on and use as a member of the public. If you did any research in college and you've used some of their products, this has been around for a long time and something that's very valuable to our institutions. The last thing, and I had them add this because it takes, personally, since I was giving the presentation, it takes up so much of my time. This is something new that we were charged with in the last session, was create and oversee a management improvement plan for Kentucky State University. Kentucky State University received a $23 million appropriation to address some financial issues there, plus an additional $15 million of incentive funding. And we are responsible for a management improvement plan for that institution. It's actually due to be completed November 1st of this year, and then it's a 3-year plan. So once we create it, then we'll have the responsibility for evaluating it during that time as well. There's a lot more things that we do as well, but these are the highlights. Here's what we don't do. We don't hire and evaluate campus presidents or any campus personnel. Now, I will tell you, as board members, Dr. Thompson is a great resource when you're and has provided counsel to board members before. I think he's even served on some search committees when you've hired presidents, because he really has that statewide perspective. Also, just being somebody in the industry is a great resource. So I encourage you to engage us when you're out hiring leaders for your campuses, but ultimately those are the individual board decisions. We don't develop individual campus strategic plans and goals. We support them, your work, what you do, and you heard Dr. Levine talk about individual campuses and kind of going out and doing your own thing and not being the same. And we support you on that, but that's ultimately up to your own boards. Determine your budget allocations within the institution. So once the funds are appropriated to you all, how you all spend it is up to you all. We're not an accreditor. That's a separate process that we don't have anything to do with. We have nothing to do with athletic programs at all. So we'll leave that up to you guys. And we're not involved in the day-to-day management. Again, we're here to coordinate and support, but you all manage the operations of your institutions. Here's some information on how to learn more. Our website is a wealth of information, so I encourage you to take a look at it when you have time. I'll just remember, in case you get yourselves in trouble, we do have, a couple years ago, I guess maybe 4 years ago now actually, we had some changes in the law with regard to removal of campus board members. So there's 3 ways that a campus member can be removed, and these are all evaluated by CPE, and we make a recommendation to the governor as to whether or not the member should be removed. We've actually had to do this before, and the recommendation was from the board to actually remove one of its members. We evaluated it and actually agreed. The way that it ended up played out, the member was almost at the end of their term, and we sent it to the governor's office for decision. He didn't make a decision. The person didn't attend any more meetings, and then when it was their term expired, they appointed somebody else. But we actually have had to do this. So you can be removed for cause, for malfeasance, or not performing your duties as a board member. Removal of all appointed board members for cause, so we can actually, if there's reason that an entire board's not meeting its responsibilities, we can seek to have them removed. And then removal of board member to comply with representation requirements. And so if you look in the statutes, there's certain representation requirements depending on the board based on the racial and ethnic makeup of the state. It needs to sort of mirror that, be at least that much. So percentage-wise, to have representation on the boards. There's geographic representations. Ours is actually at CPE is very difficult. It only can be so many members from a Supreme Court district, and it's kind of a puzzle that has to be put together. But if we're out of balance on that, we can remove members can be removed in order to make sure that we meet those requirements. I'll take it on to Sean, who's going to talk about performance funding. And but anybody have any questions for me before I hand off the mic? No? Okay.
Dr. Payne had a family emergency arise and asked me to go over these slides in his place. What's that? Yeah, my name is Sean McKiernan. I'm Executive Director of Budget and Finance at CPE. And I did help Bill come up with these slides, so let's see what I remember. And I am going to sit because it'll be easier for me to look at Bill's notes, which are pretty helpful. So, as Travis mentioned, the Council on Post-Secondary Education makes makes a biennial budget request to the General Assembly and the Governor with regard to trust funds, capital projects, and base budgets. And the focus really is on the state general fund dollars that will ultimately go to the campuses. The trust funds, there are 6 trust funds that were established in statute, and they include the endowment match funds, the physical facilities trust fund, the technology investment trust fund, the workforce development trust fund. The focus in recent years has been on the endowment match trust fund, also known as Bucks for Brains. Very popular program in the early 2000s, late 90s, and we just received another round of funding for Bucks for Brains, $40 million for the universities, and we received $2.2 million for the Workforce Development Trust Fund for this current fiscal year. So we're very excited about that. Capital projects, banner year for higher education in the state. Has everybody heard about the $700 million in asset preservation funding? This is huge. We've been asking for this funding for 10 years and haven't received any significant influx of funding for asset preservation. These are all of the non-GLISIC projects on your campuses, the steam tunnels, the electrical grids, the electrical components, the plumbing, all kinds of good projects are going to be funded with this money that has to be matched with institutional resources. 30 cents on the dollar at most at the research institutions, 15 cents on the state dollar at KCTCS institutions. And then finally, base budgets. That includes mandated programs, which are specific programs that are line itemed in your budgets for the Gatton Academy, for the Breathitt Veterinary Center, specific projects that are listed in your budget bill, and then also the other funding that goes to educate students. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Council has statutory authority to lead and provide staff support for the biennial budget process, so we work quite a bit with the budget staff at each of the institutions to develop a unified budget request. And let's see, next slide. As I mentioned, there are 4 main funding components in our budget submission: operating funds, and that's the mandated programs and also the funding that supports education of students. Trust funds, Bucks for Brains is a big component of that, but also Workforce Development Trust Fund, capital investment, and then finally, our agency's budget is part of the unified request as well. And so here's a look at the timeline. We start developing our budget in 2021. It was in July. You'll have to forgive me. I was not expecting to give this presentation. But we reviewed the components from the previous submission and talk about preliminary timeline. And the ultimate goal is by November 15th. So this is in odd numbered years to have a unified request that the institutions can get behind and help get through the budget process. And so essentially the governor typically has the first crack at the state budget, and then it goes to the General Assembly, and then they refine and review. And this most recent year that process was in reverse a little bit, but it turned out to be a very good year for higher education. So no major complaints. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The comprehensive, thank you very much. The comprehensive institutions are also at that 15 cents per state dollar. Thank you for clarifying that.
What can they use for matching, Sean?
The General Assembly has given all of the institutions, with the exception of KCTCS, authority to issue agency bonds, so issue debt to help to meet that match requirement. They can also use other institutional resources, and so a number of the campuses have an asset preservation fee, and that fee revenue can be used to either support debt payments for those agency bonds, or that fee revenue may have been collected over the years and might be sufficient to pay down a large portion of that match requirement. And then institutions have other sources as well. Private donations can be used. So there's a lot of flexibility to be able to use that match. Just not general fund dollars, of course. The intent is to use institutional resources to make that match. And then here's a look at the recommendation that we put forward for the current biennium. So in performance funding, we asked for $67.5 million in the first year and $90 million in the second year of new funding. We asked for new funding. This is all new funding. We asked for a total of, over the biennium, just shy of $160 million. And in terms of pension relief, we asked for $2.2 million in the first year and $4.4 in the second. And then you'll see that in capital investment, we only requested asset preservation funds, $700 million, and very happy that we received $700 million in asset preservation. But then on top of that, we received about $800 million in new construction dollars. And then in trust funds, we requested $60 million for Bucks for Brains, and that came in at $40 million. And we requested $2.2 million in the first year and $4.5 million in the second year for the Competitive Workforce Initiative, essentially Workforce Development Trust Fund at KCTCS. And the General Assembly gave us the 2.2 in the first year, and there was no appropriation in the second year. So I'm personally hopeful that we can go to the General Assembly and say, look at all the great stuff we've done with 2.2 million. Remember, we requested 4.5 in the second year, and we would like that level of funding going forward as well. So hopeful that we can make that happen. And correct. So that the allocation, CPE conducted a study many years ago that looked at the needs of each of the campuses, and our suggestion was that that study's results be used to distribute that $700 million. The legislature came back and said, we'd rather distribute that money based on your share of square footage. And we said, we will take the money regardless. So we didn't fight them on that. That's a very logical way to distribute the money as well. Yes, sir. Primarily, it was each institution's #1 project.
So when we submit a list of projects to the General Assembly as part of our budget recommendation, there's a priority list. And each institution had their #1 priority, and it's line item. So while the asset preservation is a sum amount for individual projects that have been listed, the big new construction projects are line item listed in the budget, and so you know exactly which ones those are by looking at the budget bill. I want to guys take your time and just say, for you guys, since you guys are new, the fact that we got money this last session was unprecedented. I mean, we have been. And they always tell us to give us, tell us what you need, and we would do that, kind of understanding that there wasn't a lot to divvy out. And this year, in some instances, we got even more than what we asked for, and that was just atypical. And before we were fighting, well, please don't cut us. Well, you're going to cut us 5%. Well, just cut us 2%. That was what we were talking about before. And this has been a whole new ball game for us. I just wanted to make that mention for you folks that are new, that we're actually getting reinvestment in higher education, and so we're very excited about that, because that has not been the case in the last 10. Sean and I have been working together for about 10 years at CPE, and it has not been the case in the past 10 years.
And I didn't mention, we did receive $80 million in each year for performance funding, and that's the first set of funding for performance funding. We received 17 the year before.
And in some cases, well, and just to say, and I know I think there's a slide on here about performance funding, or at least that's what he's supposed to talk about, but they were cut. A lot of that money distributed was cut out of the institution's base too. So it wasn't even that it was, in some instances, not even new money. It was money being redistributed based out of institutions' bases, whereas this was all new money. And I think you'll talk about this. Performance funding model changed to maintain the bases of institutions, but when it was originally conceptualized, they would put up money out of the institution's base at risk and get redistributed based on performance. And that didn't happen this year. So
Performance funding really only works if you get more money to reward performance. So otherwise, you're just, making cuts until morale improves, right? So, yes, sir. I mean, you can certainly contact us. Your budget officers at your institution, they're very familiar with the funding, with the process, the projects. Each campus has a list of projects that they're working with and refining. And the projects are in various stages. Some are being put out to bid. The timing of these projects is very important, because you can't work on a classroom building if there's classes being taught at that time. The timing is important. A lot of HVAC projects, a lot of roofing projects, but your campus officials are very, very familiar with this funding and how it's being used. And you can feel free to contact CPE. We've received information from all of your campuses, and we'd be happy to share that. It's all public information. Performance funding, CPE has statutory responsibility for performance funding, and we helped create, with the college presidents, with university presidents, KCTCS president, and leaders from the House, Senate, and the governor's office, helped create the funding model that we use for performance funding. It's really an allocation model, so it takes whatever funding's available and distributes that funding to the institutions. And it's a comprehensive model, so it's not a bonus pool. It looks at all of the funding that an institution receives, and then it looks at all of the metrics that are included in the model, and then it uses whatever is in the performance funding pool to get all of the institutions to formula, if you will. So it's a little complex, but I think this group can handle it. So the impetus for the model was to accelerate progress toward attainment of state goals between 2000 and 2009. When the system was receiving an influx of funding, we were really making some great progress towards our state goals, and the progress had started to falter a bit, and so performance funding or outcomes-based funding was thought to be a way to accelerate that progress. We had been using for about 10 years a base plus or base minus funding method, and so essentially whatever funding we recommended was just a percentage more for everybody across the board every year, and typically we received maybe the funding we got last year minus a percentage point or two. And so with that kind of model, as there are changes in the system, those changes don't go rewarded, and so that was a problem. A lot of disparities had developed over that time. And then finally, the budget bill required us to come up with this funding model. and they took some of the, they took a 5% carve out from each institution and put it in the performance fund, and said, if you want to get this money back, you need to come up with a model to distribute this funding. So that was a good incentive for the institutions to get together and come up with a model that they could all live with. And so this looks at some of the disparities that had developed over time. This is a look at net general fund appropriations per FTE student in 15-16. So this is before the funding model, and you can see that at Moorhead and Murray, $5,700 per student, $5,400 per student on average of state dollars. And then you can see that Western and Northern, who had been growing at that time, were down to $4,700 per student, $4,100 per student. And we had calculated that to bring them up to the median, to that Eastern level, would require an additional $4.7 million for Western and an additional $10.3 million for Northern. And you might imagine that some of these institutions would go to the General Assembly and say, we've got to do something about this disparity. And the performance funding was part of the answer to that. You need to come up with a better plan to allocate money so it's more fair. And so the working group was composed of the governor, the representative of the Senate, representative of the House, president of each of the public universities, and the KCTCS president, council president, and charged with developing a model. And the goals of the model were to increase retention and progression, grow the number of degrees and credentials that garner higher salaries upon graduation, STEM plus H, high wage, high demand field degrees and credentials, close achievement gaps. And so the model that was developed looks like a peace sign. 35% of students of the funding is allocated, of the allocable resources is dedicated to student success. And there's a bunch of metrics that go into that. It includes degrees and credentials awarded, degrees per 100 full-time enrollments, STEM plus H degrees, degrees earned by minority and low-income students. A bunch of student progression metrics are included in the student success, 35%. Another 35% of the available funds is distributed based on course completion, and that is earned credit hours weighted for cost differences, which include degree level and academic discipline. So we have a chart that shows comparative costs of different degrees and in the various disciplines and at the various levels. So a graduate course in a health field would be a multiple of 3.5, let's say, versus a general education class at a lower division level. So 35% of the funding is based on course completion, and then 10% on square footage of the institution, 10% of the funding based on each institution's share of sector total instruction and student services spending, and 10% on full-time enrollment, so academic support. And so that's a high-level look at performance funding. Any questions about performance funding before we move on? Okay. Right. And as Travis mentioned, tuition fee setting, CPE has statutory authority to determine tuition. That's the language in the statute. And that's operationalized at CPE by adopting ceilings for resident undergraduate tuition and mandatory fees. So we include mandatory fees as part of our definition for tuition. Campuses are permitted to charge non-resident students in accordance with our non-resident tuition policy. We also have agreements with many of the campuses to go below the threshold that is set in our policy if they have a memorandum of understanding with the council that allows them to deviate somewhat from the threshold that's established in the policy. So there are some exceptions. And institutions are typically allowed to charge market competitive rates for online and graduate courses and programs, and generally the council approves campus proposals that comply with the rate ceilings and our policies. And look at the timeline. We typically start talking about tuition and mandatory fee setting in November and December, and then usually in April, the council approves tuition and fee ceilings. There's a lot of collaboration with campus officials between November, December, and April and May. We usually talk to student body presidents. We talk to legislators and folks in the governor's office. So we look at a lot of data too. We believe this to be a data-driven process. We look at changes in fixed costs. We look at other changes in cost, and try to come up with a rate that serves the needs of the institutions, but also a rate increase that families and students can live with, and then in June we typically approve final rates, and so that just shows the process we use to approve tuition and fees. And let's see, before 2009-10, CPE had essentially devolved tuition setting to the institutions, and during that time they had a large increase on average over those years prior to 2009-10, and then you can see those. I guess it's over those 6 years. It was 11.7% average annual growth rate in tuition, and since CPE has taken over the tuition and fee ceiling process, since we initiated that, the average annual growth rate has been much lower, 3.6%, and you can see in recent years it's been very, very low, under 1.5%. For the last 3 years, and that's a real credit to CPE's board and also to the campuses that they can make that work.
But last slide. Just want to note here too. If you look, and I know some of it's hard to see in the back, but if you look here at some of these increases, back in the 2010, 2012, 6, 5%, 3%. This was also during a time when institutions were getting cut by the General Assembly, and these tuition increases did not fill the gaps completely of what our institutions were losing. So I think there was some thought out there that, well, they're getting cut and they're just going to take, well, okay, fine, we get cut this much from General Assembly, we'll just charge students that much more, and it actually did not completely fill the gap. Institutions made cuts on their own. They instituted efficiencies to try to keep this number down. I mean, we definitely held the line, but the institutions work too, because they know that they're working with students and families, and it's got to be affordable for them to come. So there was a lot of work done there between us and the campuses to manage those budget decreases, but also keep the tuition increases at a reasonable level. Does anybody have any questions for us? I think we've timed this perfectly, Sean. Right at 10:45. So happy to answer any questions we may have. Any? No? Okay. Well, if anybody does have any questions, my email address is just my name. It's very easy, travis.powell@ky.gov. Feel free to shoot me a note. We can get you any answers that you have that you need on anything. And appreciate your all's time. And good luck to you all in your service as new board members.